In the dead of a raging snowstorm, a desperate knock shatters the night. Sarah Mitchell and her young daughter open the door to a haunting sight. A bloodied service dog collapsing, leading them to a chilling secret at the foot of the mountain. From that moment, their lives spiral into a fight for survival, where courage, betrayal, and love are pushed to their ultimate limits. The storm came without mercy. By nightfall, Silver Creek was already swallowed by white. The kind of cold that didn't just bite skin, it settled in bone. Wind tore through the pine-covered mountains like a living thing howling with a voice older than the town itself. Snow blasted sideways in angry sheets, erasing road signs and sound. Power lines snapped like brittle twigs. Silence had no place here, only the roar of winter's fury. Inside a modest cabin near the edge of town, the windows rattled under the storm's breath. Sarah Mitchell stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. Her eyes were fixed on the frost-cloaked glass, watching the snow pile higher against the porch railing. She hadn't turned on the lights. Not because of the outage, they still had power somehow, but because the dark fit her mood. Her late husband's coat still hung by the door, untouched since last winter. She couldn't bring herself to move it. It was the last thing he wore before the accident, before everything changed. Upstairs, her daughter Lily hummed softly to herself as she folded paper cranes on her bed. The 11-year-old had inherited her father's stubborn kindness and her mother's quiet strength. But lately, her bright energy had dulled. Even her drawings, once filled with sunshine and horses, had taken on a shade of gray. Sarah didn't blame her. Grief was the storm they couldn't shovel their way out of. The wind howled louder, rattling the back window. Somewhere outside, something heavy fell. A branch, maybe, or something worse. Sarah flinched, her heartbeat quickening. Old instincts she thought she'd buried began to stir. She placed the mug down and moved toward the front door, checking the lock even though she'd done so twice already. Then knocking. 3 sharp, desperate thuds. Not the wind, not falling ice. Someone or something was at the door. Sarah froze. 1,000 thoughts flashed through her mind. Nobody should be out in a storm like this. Not on this road. The cabin was half a mile from the nearest neighbor. Even the mail truck didn't come up here during winter. She hesitated only a second longer before reaching for the fire poker and stepping cautiously toward the door. Her fingers hovered over the knob. The storm screamed just beyond the threshold. Another knock, louder this time, more urgent. Almost rhythmic. She opened the door, and there, collapsing against the porch like a shadow torn from the woods, was a dog. Not just any dog. A Belgian Malinois, sleek, powerful, trained. Its coat was dark tan, mottled with dirt and streaked with blood. One paw was lifted, trembling midair. Its breath came in shallow bursts, steam curling from its muzzle. Amber eyes flicked up at her, wide with pain, but laser-sharp. Its right flank was soaked in crimson. A jagged wound near the leg still oozed through the fur. Around its neck hung a dark collar, and attached to it a battered K9 badge. Sarah's breath caught. This wasn't a lost pet. This was law enforcement. A working dog. A soldier. She dropped to her knees, instinctively, her training from vet school surging to the surface. Hey, easy, easy, she murmured, her voice soft and steady. The dog growled low, not threatening, more like warning her of pain. Then it slumped fully against the wood, panting. Lily, Sarah shouted into the house, eyes never leaving the injured animal. Bring me the med kit, now. Footsteps scrambled overhead, followed by the pounding of small feet on the stairs. What is it? Lily gasped from the hallway, her eyes wide when she saw the heap of fur and blood on the porch. Oh my gosh. Sarah didn't answer. She was already checking for a pulse, for warmth, for signs of shock. But the moment she touched the dog's side, something else caught her eye, a smear of blood on the porch boards, trailing backward down the steps into the darkness. It wasn't from the dog. It was a footprint, human-sized, mixed with blood. Fresh. Sarah's hands stilled. There was someone else out there, or had been. She looked again at the dog. It stared back at her, shivering, but didn't move. Its eyes flicked to the trail of blood in the snow, then back to her, then to Lily. It was communicating. Her mind raced. Dogs like this, K9s, weren't trained to seek help unless it was an emergency. And they didn't just appear on a doorstep miles from town. Not unless something had gone horribly wrong. She examined the collar again and found a nameplate half buried in the fur. Rex. No last name, no unit. Just Rex and a 4-digit number, 1872. That confirmed it. This was a service dog, and he was in trouble. Help me get him inside, Sarah said, shifting her weight to support the dog. Careful, he's hurt bad. Together, she and Lily hauled Rex into the warmth of the cabin, laying him down near the hearth on a folded blanket. The fire crackled, casting shadows over his blood-stained fur. Lily knelt beside him, her eyes glossy. He's so brave. Sarah said nothing. She was already working cutting away fur around the wound, cleaning with antiseptic wrapping gauze. Her hands moved on autopilot, precise, steady, but her mind was in overdrive. Why was this dog alone? Who did he belong to? Where was his handler? And what the hell happened out there in the storm? A low whine escaped Rex's throat. His paw twitched. His eyes darted to the door again, then back to Sarah. He was trying to tell her something. "Something's wrong," she whispered aloud. "Someone needs help. Mom." Lily's voice was small. "Should we call the police?" Sarah hesitated. She glanced at the wall-mounted landline. No signal. Figures. She checked her cell. Dead. Satellite phone buried in the Jeep outside under a foot of snow. No help was coming. Not anytime soon. She turned back to Rex. "You came for a reason, didn't you?" He stared at her. Blood still trickled from the gash near his leg, but he didn't look afraid. Only determined. She rose, grabbed her coat from the hook, and turned to Lily. "Get your boots on." Lily blinked. "What?" "We're following that blood trail. Now." Sarah looked out the window. The snow was falling harder than ever. Wind whipped through the trees in blinding gusts. "Now," she said, "whoever sent Rex, they might still be alive." "But what if it's dangerous?" "It already is," Sarah said quietly. "That's why we don't wait." She glanced back once more at the dog, then reached out and pressed her palm against Rex's head. "Stay," she said gently. But Rex didn't move. Instead, with a grunt of effort, he stood, limping, staggering, but upright. He took a shaky step toward the door. Then another. "Mom," Lily whispered, eyes wide. Sarah understood. Rex wasn't going to stay behind. He was going back out, injured or not. Sarah swallowed hard. "Then we go together." She grabbed the flashlight, slung her emergency pack over one shoulder, stuffed gauze, antiseptic, a flare gun, and 2 thermal blankets inside. Lily zipped her coat and slid her tiny hand into Sarah's. They stepped onto the porch into the full force of the blizzard. And behind them, limping but steady, Rex followed, leaving a trail of blood on the snow that was already being swallowed by the storm. The wind didn't let up. It screamed through the trees, driving needles of ice into Sarah's cheeks as she stepped off the porch. Her flashlight beam cut a shaky path through the storm. Snowflakes hurled themselves into the light, chaotic blinding. The cold slammed into her lungs, sharp as broken glass. Beside her, Lily clutched the strap of her mother's coat, her small boots crunching in the drifts. Rex limped a few steps ahead, his silhouette barely visible in the swirling white. Each paw print he left behind bled red into the snow. The sight made Sarah's chest tighten, but she didn't stop him. He was following the same trail that had led him to their door, the trail they now had no choice but to follow. The footprints were half covered already, but still there. Large human. They cut through the snow like scars, and streaking between them, a smear of crimson. Lily's voice trembled. "Mom, what if we get lost?" "We won't," Sarah said, though her throat felt tight. "Just hold on to me. Don't let go." The trail dipped downward, curving along the slope where the pines thinned. Sarah aimed the flashlight lower, and the beam landed on something that made her heart stop cold. Metal, twisted, glinting under a sheet of ice. "God," she whispered. They edged closer. It was a vehicle, what was left of one. A police SUV overturned on its side against the base of a slope half buried by snow. Its windshield spiderwebbed with cracks. The siren light on top was frozen solid, a red lens peeking through a crust of white. The driver's door hung wide, snow gusting inside. The tires spun slowly, creaking against the ice. Sarah's gut clenched. This wasn't an accident. It felt like something worse. Rex barked once, low and sharp, then limped straight toward the SUV, his nose pressed to the snow. He whined, pawing at the crumpled metal. Sarah swung the flashlight beam inside. That's when she saw him. A man, slumped sideways against the wheel, his uniform half obscured by snow and glass, his head lolled forward, blood staining his temple. For a moment, Sarah thought he was dead. Then his chest rose, barely. A shallow breath. Another. Mom, Lily's voice cracked. "He's alive." Sarah's body moved before her brain could catch up. She dropped to her knees beside the shattered window, scanning for a way in. The driver's side was wedged against the slope. She yanked at the back door, frozen shut. She slammed her shoulder against it. Once. Twice. The third time it gave shrieking open, with a crack of ice. The cold inside was worse than outside, like a tomb. "Hold the light steady," she told Lily, crawling halfway inside. Shards of glass crunched under her gloves. The man's face came into view, pale, streaked with blood. He looked young, no older than 30. His badge was smeared, but the name was still legible. Hayes. Daniel Hayes. His lips were blue, his pulse a faint flutter beneath her fingers. Stay with me, Sarah murmured, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her ribs. You hear me? You're not dying in here. His eyelids flickered barely. Rex barked again, frantic. Snow gusted harder, already filling the SUV's back seat. Sarah knew they had minutes before the vehicle was buried. Lily, blankets out of the pack, she shouted. Her daughter scrambled, pulling out the thermal rolls. Sarah worked quickly, draping one over his chest, the other beneath his legs. She tugged at the seatbelt, pinning him down, but it was jammed tight. She fumbled for the pocket knife in her coat. The blade tore through the strap. The man sagged against her dead weight. She gritted her teeth, bracing her back. Help me pull. Together, she and Lily dragged him out inch by inch. Rex pressed close, nosing his partner, whining low. Snow swirled around them, coating their clothes, their lashes, their fear. The moment Daniel's boots hit the snow outside, Sarah collapsed backward, breath ragged. His head rolled onto her lap. His eyes snapped open, wild, panicked. No. They'll find us. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. His hand clawed weakly at the air as though still fighting unseen enemies. You don't understand. They're coming. Sarah gripped his shoulders firm. You're safe. You're out. He coughed, the sound tearing through his chest. No. Not safe. Not safe. His gaze darted to the tree line. They'll kill you. You have to run. Sarah's breath caught. Who's coming? But Daniel's eyes clouded. His head lolled again, breath shallow. The fight drained out of him in seconds. Mom? Lily's voice shook. What if he dies? He won't, Sarah said. She prayed the words were true. She turned to Rex. The dog was standing now, tail, stiff ears, pricked toward the darkness beyond the pines. A growl rumbled in his throat. Sarah followed his gaze, and for the first time that night, she wished she hadn't. At the edge of the woods, barely visible through the sheets of snow, 2 faint beams of light glowed. Headlights. Crawling slowly. Hunting. Daniel's warning echoed in her mind. They'll kill you. You have to run. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Lily, she said, her voice sharp but calm. Listen to me. We have to move. Now. But where? Back to the cabin. It's our only chance. She hoisted Daniel's arm over her shoulder, grunting at the weight. His body was limp, but some instinct inside her refused to leave him behind. Not after he'd fought to survive this long. Not after Rex had bled to find her. Rex limped to her side, pressing against Daniel's other leg, as if helping to steady him. Mom, Lily whispered, her eyes fixed on the headlights that crept closer through the storm. They see us. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to, because deep down, she already knew they were being hunted, and the night was far from over. The forest swallowed them whole. Snow draped over every branch, muffling the world into silence, except for the roar of the wind and the crunch of hurried boots. Sarah's breath came in ragged bursts as she half-dragged Daniel through the trees. He stumbled beside her, his weight heavy, his breaths shallow. Rex limped close to his partner, amber eyes sharp despite the blood still streaking his flank. Lily clung to Sarah's coat, her small steps struggling to keep pace. Behind them, faint but undeniable, came the sound of engines. Low, steady, creeping closer. Sarah didn't dare look back. The forest offered little cover. Every gust of wind threatened to strip their tracks bare. But for now, those tracks were leading their hunters straight to them. Daniel groaned, his head lolling. She tightened her grip around his waist. Stay with me, she urged. His eyes cracked open, glassy with pain, but burning with urgency. You don't know what you've walked into. Then tell me, Sarah snapped. Because right now, I'm dragging you through a damn blizzard, and my daughter's in the middle of this. He coughed, the sound raw, before whispering. They're not just thugs. Armed, organized. Ex-police. One of them. His voice faltered, his throat tightening with rage. One of them was my brother in uniform. Sarah frowned, forcing them both around a thick pine. A cop. Daniel nodded weakly. James Rourke. We served together. I trusted him with my life. Tonight, I watched him put a bullet in Carter. My partner didn't even blink. The words hit like a blow. Sarah's mind reeled. Betrayal like that cut deeper than any wound. Why? They pulled off a job, Daniel said, his voice shaking. Armored truck. Millions. They needed me out of the way. I was supposed to die in that SUV. His gaze hardened through the pain. And if they catch us, you and your little girl won't make it either. Sarah's chest tightened, her fear transforming into cold fire. She gritted her teeth, adjusting Daniel's weight as they pressed forward. Then we won't let them catch us. Rex growled low, his ears snapping toward the distant hum behind them. Snow scattered as his paws pressed deeper into the drifts. The dog wasn't just following, he was guarding. Every twitch of his muscles screamed vigilance, even through pain. Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, I'm scared." Sarah squeezed her hand, never slowing. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. But don't let it stop you." Daniel winced, coughing again, his breath leaving a crimson stain on the snow. Sarah's stomach twisted at the sight, hypothermia and blood loss. If they didn't get him somewhere safe soon, he wouldn't last the night. She glanced around desperately. The forest stretched endless and merciless. But she spotted a cluster of boulders ahead, partially shielded by low pines. Shelter. Not much, but something. "Over there," she murmured, steering them toward the rocks. They reached the hollow, dropping to the snow behind the stones. Sarah eased Daniel down carefully. His head lolled back, sweat slicking his pale skin despite the freezing air. Lily knelt beside him, holding the flashlight steady. "Is he gonna die?" "Not if I can help it," Sarah muttered, digging into the emergency kit. Her hands worked fast gauze antiseptic pressure against the wound in his side. He flinched, but didn't pull away. His jaw clenched tight. "You're a doctor," he rasped. "Veterinarian," Sarah said, without looking up. "But the blood's the same color." Despite the storm, he gave a weak, humorless chuckle. "Figures. Saved by a vet." Her eyes flicked up sharply. "Saved by a mother." For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the wind clawing at the trees. Then Rex shifted, a sharp bark tearing through the night. He faced the trail they'd left, hackles raised. Snow whipped around his form, his breath steaming in quick bursts. His body trembled not just from cold, but from tension. "They're close," Daniel whispered, his hand twitching toward Rex. "He can feel it." Sarah's stomach sank. She looked at Lily, her daughter's green eyes wide, reflecting both fear and unyielding trust. She'd promised to keep her safe. She couldn't break that promise now. Daniel reached for her sleeve, gripping weakly. "You should leave me. Take your daughter and run. They want me." Sarah froze. The thought stabbed at her, but only for a second. She shoved it aside with a fierce shake of her head. "Not a chance. Rex didn't drag himself bleeding through a blizzard for me to abandon you." His lips parted as though to argue, but her expression silenced him. There was no room for debate. She tightened the bandage with a final pull, ignoring his hiss of pain. "Can you walk?" He hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Not far." "Far enough," she muttered, helping him to his feet. She looked at Lily. "Stay close. Don't stop unless I say." The girl nodded, her face pale but resolute. She was her father's daughter, brave in the face of the storm. Rex whined low, glancing at Daniel, then back at the dark trail. He pressed against his handler's leg, limping, but ready. Sarah tightened her grip on Daniel's arm. Her voice was steady, sharper than the wind. "Then we move." They pushed deeper into the trees. The forest grew darker, the storm louder. Branches whipped at their faces. Snow sank beneath their boots, dragging at their legs. Every breath burned. Every step felt like it might be their last. Behind them, the faint crack of branches. Footsteps. Not theirs. Daniel stiffened. "They're here." Rex barked once, loud, defiant, before snapping his head toward the sound. His teeth flashed in the dim light, a silent promise that anyone who came close would regret it. Sarah's heart pounded, her body a live wire of fear and adrenaline. She glanced back at Lily, who clung tight, her eyes wide, but determined. There was no turning back now. In that frozen, merciless night, survival had become their only mission. And the hunt had just begun. The snowstorm was no longer just a storm. It was a predator, swallowing the night, howling through the pines, as though it meant to drive them into the abyss. Sarah's boots pounded through the drifts, her muscles burning as she dragged Daniel's half-conscious body across the frozen ground. His weight felt heavier with every step. His head sagged against her shoulder, his breath shallow, his skin cold as the ice beneath them. Mom Lily's cry tore through the roar of the wind. Sarah whipped her head around just in time to see it, a flare of orange in the distance, splitting the storm with a deafening crack. The bullet hissed through the night, smashing into a tree trunk inches from where Lily had been. Bark exploded into the snow. "Run!" Sarah screamed, shoving her daughter forward. Rex barked fiercely, his body a blur of black and tan, as he leapt ahead, teeth bared, guiding them through the blizzard. Another shot split the night, then another. The men were closing in. "Don't look back." Sarah's voice was raw, more command than plea. Her heart hammered in her chest, adrenaline flooding her veins, forcing her to keep moving, even as her legs trembled under Daniel's dead weight. Ahead, the ground changed. Snow thinned, revealing a sheen of ice stretching across a narrow pass, the kind of surface that groaned under even the lightest step. Her stomach dropped. If it didn't hold, she pulled Lily close. "Stay on my heels. Do not stop." Lily nodded, her green eyes wide, reflecting the faint beam of the flashlight clutched tight in her mittened hand. Sarah stepped onto the ice. It moaned beneath her boot, echoing like a warning through the night. The cold air carried every sound her breathing. Daniel's faint groans, Rex's labored pants. Halfway across the ice, cracked, a jagged sound sharp and final. Mom Lily screamed, slipping her small body pitching sideways toward the edge, where the ice broke off into a black gorge. Sarah's heart froze. She lunged, but she was too far. Rex wasn't. The German shepherd hurled himself across the ice, his injured hind leg buckling, but his teeth clamping onto Lily's coat just as she slid toward the edge. The momentum wrenched his body dangerously close to the drop, his claws scraping for purchase, but he held. Lily screamed, clutching the dog's thick fur. "Hold on, baby," Sarah cried, hauling Daniel forward and dropping him on firmer ground before scrambling back across the cracking ice. She reached them, her hands seizing Lily's arms, dragging her back to safety. Rex staggered beside them, panting, eyes burning with determination, even as blood stained the snow under his paw. Sarah hugged her daughter tight, tears burning her frozen lashes. "You're safe. You're safe." But there was no time to breathe. The shouts came clearer now, carried by the wind. Male voices, rough mocking. "They're right behind us," Daniel rasped weakly, his lips nearly blue. They'll catch us if we stop." Sarah pulled him up again, ignoring the screaming protest of her muscles. "Then we don't stop." The ice gave way behind them, with a thunderous crack plunging into the gorge below. The sound echoed, like the world breaking. If they'd been 1 minute slower, they would have been gone. Snow swirled so thick now that the flashlight beam seemed swallowed whole. Sarah pushed forward blindly, her breath burning, her body aching. She didn't know how much farther she could go, only that stopping meant death. Then Rex barked once sharp and urgent and darted toward a shadow in the rock face. Sarah followed his lead, dragging Daniel and pulling Lily close. A narrow opening half hidden by snowdrifts, a hollow carved into the mountain itself, shelter. She forced them inside, collapsing against the cold stone wall. The howling wind dulled, muffled by the rock, though the storm still clawed outside. Sarah lowered Daniel onto the icy ground. His eyes were barely open now, his skin ashen, his lips trembling uncontrollably. She pressed her hand to his forehead. "Ice." "No," she whispered, panic flaring in her chest. She grabbed the emergency kit, her fingers shaking. "Not like this. You are not dying here." "Mom," Lily's voice cracked. She knelt beside Daniel, her flashlight trembling in her hands. "What's happening?" Sarah's mind raced, instincts snapping back into place. The instincts she'd buried after losing her husband, the ones she thought she'd never need again. Emergency medicine, trauma protocol, keep him warm, stop the shock. She ripped off her own coat, wrapping it around Daniel, ignoring the icy bite against her arms. "He's going into shock. We need to raise his body temperature now." She pulled a blanket from the pack, tucking it tight around him. Lily followed her instructions without hesitation, pressing her own scarf around Daniel's neck. His breathing came shallow, uneven. His eyes fluttered, and for a terrible second Sarah thought she was too late. "Daniel," she said sharply, gripping his jaw, forcing his gaze to hers. "Stay with me. Do you hear me? Stay awake." He blinked slow and weak, his lips parting. "Cold, I know," she murmured, her voice fierce, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "But you're not leaving us. Not tonight." Rex whined softly, curling against his handler's side, his own body trembling, his warmth pressed against Daniel's arm, his steady heartbeat a silent plea for him to fight. Lily's small hand slid into Sarah's. "Will he live?" Sarah hesitated. The truth knifed her chest. She didn't know. But Lily's eyes begged for more than truth. They begged for hope. "Yes," Sarah whispered, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Because we won't let him die." Outside, the storm howled louder, as though mocking their fragile refuge. Footsteps crunched faintly on the snow, above men calling to each other. The hunters were circling. Sarah bent over Daniel, her lips close to his ear. "You hold on. We'll get through this. But I need you to fight." His lashes fluttered, the faintest nod. And in that dark hollow carved into the mountain with death pressing at their walls, Sarah Mitchell made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would keep them alive. The fire Sarah had coaxed to life from scraps of kindling hissed faintly in the hollow of the mountain cave, its glow flickering weakly against the stone walls. Outside, the storm shrieked like a wounded beast, the wind lashing at the narrow opening snow, drifting in pale sheets across the threshold. Sarah sat with her back against the cold stone, her arm draped protectively around Lily, whose head rested against her shoulder. The girl's eyes, though tired, remained wide open, too wired to surrender to sleep. Rex lay near Daniel, his large head resting on his paws, his amber eyes alert even as his body trembled from the wound in his hind leg. His ears flicked at every distant sound, every phantom whisper the storm might have carried. Daniel stirred a low groan escaping his lips. His chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths, his lashes fluttering before his steel-gray eyes blinked open. For a moment, he seemed lost, his gaze unfocused, until it landed on Rex. A faint, exhausted smile touched his face as the dog shifted, pressing his muzzle gently against his arm. "You're awake," Sarah said softly, relief slipping into her voice despite the fear still coiled tight inside her. Daniel's lips twitched into a grimace that was meant to be a smile. For now he rasped, his voice raw and hoarse. He tried to sit up and Sarah's hands shot out to steady him. "Don't," she warned firmly. "You need to stay still." He looked at her, the corners of his eyes etched with pain, but also with a stubborn defiance. "Still means dead," he whispered. "And I can't afford that. Not yet." Sarah held his gaze, reading the weight behind his words. She wanted to argue to tell him that moving would only tear his body apart faster. But the look in his eyes silenced her. He wasn't a man who gave up easily. Lily shifted beside her, her small voice barely a whisper. "Why are they chasing you?" "Who are they?" Daniel exhaled slowly, as though the air itself carried a burden too heavy to release. He looked down at Rex, his fingers absently brushing the dog's fur. The animal's eyes lifted to his, a silent exchange between man and dog that seemed older than words. "It was supposed to be routine." Daniel began, his voice low, every word carrying the weight of memory. "A transport detail. Armored truck moving through the North Road. We'd done it a dozen times. Same team, same route. Nothing special. Until tonight." He paused, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. His eyes darkened, as if replaying each moment behind them. "They hit us hard. Precision coordination. Whoever planned it, they knew exactly how we operated. Positions, signals, timing. Too exact to be chance." Sarah's breath caught the truth threading together in her mind. "Inside information." Daniel nodded. "Yeah. A setup." He clenched his jaw, the memory twisting his features. "Carter, my partner, didn't even see it coming. One second he was covering the left flank, the next." His voice cracked just for a second. He looked away, blinking hard. A bullet through the chest. Dropped him instantly. Lily gasped softly, her hand clutching Sarah's sleeve. "That's horrible." Daniel's lips thinned. It wasn't just any shooter. It was James Rourke. He let the name hang in the cold air like a curse. Sarah frowned. "The man you said was like a brother." Daniel nodded, his voice rough. "We went through the academy together, covered each other's backs on raids. I trusted him more than anyone." He glanced down at Rex, his eyes shadowed. So did Rex. The dog shifted his ears, pricking at the sound of his name. His gaze steady, as if he understood. "Rex belonged to Carter," Daniel explained softly. "They were inseparable. That dog would have followed him through hell and back. And he did right up until the moment Rourke pulled the trigger." Sarah's stomach tightened, the image of the loyal dog, watching his handler die, pressing into her heart like a blade. She looked at Rex, lying silently in the dim light, his chest rising and falling with steady resolve. The thought of him seeing that moment, unable to stop it, unable to protect the man he loved, nearly broke her. Lily's eyes brimmed with tears. "But why didn't Rex run away?" "He could have left when he saw them." Her voice trembled, the innocent question laced with confusion and pain. Daniel looked at her, his gaze softening despite the storm raging inside him. He reached out weakly, brushing Rex's fur with trembling fingers. "Because loyalty doesn't break when it's tested," he said quietly. "It only proves itself." Rex didn't run because he made a choice. To stand. Even if it meant getting hurt. Even if it meant losing everything. The dog lifted his head, leaning into Daniel's touch. His amber eyes glowed in the flickering firelight, steady, unblinking, carrying the weight of truths words could never hold. Lily swallowed, her young face etched with wonder. So, he stayed. Even when it hurt. Daniel nodded, especially when it hurt. The cave fell silent except for the faint pop of the fire and the storm's muffled rage outside. Sarah looked at Rex, really looked. Not as a wounded animal at her doorstep, not as some half-stranger bound to a man she barely knew, but as a living symbol of loyalty, of devotion, of the kind of strength she thought she'd lost the day her husband died. She felt her throat tighten, her chest ache. For so long she had walked through life with a wall around her heart, protecting herself, protecting Lily, believing that the kind of faith that once guided her had burned out with her grief. But here was this animal bleeding and broken, refusing to give up, refusing to abandon his partner or the people who needed him. Maybe, just maybe, she thought she could find that courage again. Her hand drifted to Rex's head, stroking gently. He leaned into her touch, his warmth pressing into her palm, like a vow. Daniel watched her, his tired eyes softening. "You see it too, don't you?" Sarah met his gaze. "What?" "The fight," he said simply. "The choice to stand when it'd be easier to fall. That dog doesn't know how to quit. And neither do you." She opened her mouth to deny it, to say she wasn't strong anymore. But the words died on her tongue. Lily squeezed her mother's arm gently. "He's like us, Mom. He doesn't want to be alone." The truth of it sank into Sarah's bones. She bent down, pressing a soft kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Neither do we, baby." The fire flickered low shadows dancing against the stone. The storm howled. The hunters prowled, and danger still lurked just beyond the cave's mouth. But in that moment, amid fear and pain, Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't in years. Not just fear, not just determination. Hope. And it burned as stubbornly as the dog lying at their side. The storm had calmed, only enough to reveal its cruelty. Snow lay in deceptive silence across the mountain trail, each drift hiding secrets beneath. Sarah led the way, her flashlight trembling with every step, while Lily held tightly to her mother's hand. Daniel stumbled just behind them, leaning heavily on her for support. Rex limped in front, his injured leg, dragging slightly, yet his posture alert, his nose sweeping the cold air for danger. They had barely gone half a mile when Rex froze. His ears shot forward, his body stiffening as a low growl rumbled in his throat. Sarah stopped instantly, pulling Lily behind her. "What is it?" she whispered, her breath forming a pale cloud in the frigid air. Rex barked sharply once, and then lowered his head, sniffing the snow. He pawed at a drift and stopped abruptly, his gaze snapping back to Sarah with a look that screamed warning. Sarah crouched, sweeping the beam of light lower. At first she saw only ice and powder. Then her breath caught. A thin, nearly invisible strand of steel wire glistened faintly beneath the snow, stretched across the trail at knee height. Her stomach dropped. A tripwire. Daniel cursed under his breath, his voice hoarse. "Booby traps." Sarah's heart pounded as her gaze followed the wire to a mound of snow just a few feet ahead. Buried beneath it, she spotted the faint outline of a crude device wires, glinting faintly in the light. A homemade mine. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, pulling Lily tighter against her. They rigged the trail. Before she could say more, Rex moved. Quick as lightning, he shoved his body against Lily, knocking her sideways just as her boot brushed the edge of the tripwire. The explosion ripped the silence apart. A sharp crack followed by a violent eruption of snow, dirt, and metal. Shrapnel screamed through the air, fragments slicing into the night. Lily cried out as she hit the ground. The wind knocked from her lungs. Sarah dropped beside her, shielding her daughter with her body as the blast thundered past. When the world settled, the snow was littered with debris, smoke curling upward into the storm. "Lily?" Sarah's voice was frantic as she checked her daughter's hands, trembling. "Are you hurt?" I'm okay." Lily gasped, eyes wide, her voice shaking. Relief flooded Sarah until she heard it, a sharp pained whimper. She turned, her heart twisting. Rex lay in the snow, his body heaving, his hind leg, bleeding heavily where jagged shrapnel had torn into him. His amber eyes flickered not with weakness, but with the same fierce determination Sarah had come to recognize. "No!" Sarah's voice cracked as she scrambled to his side. She pressed her hands to the wound, blood seeping hot through her fingers into the icy air. "No, no, no." For the first time since the night began, her voice broke not in command or warning, but in desperation. "Rex," she cried, his name torn from her throat like she was calling a loved one. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." Rex whimpered again, licking her wrist weakly. His eyes locked on hers, as if to promise he wasn't giving up. Daniel knelt beside them, his face pale, his hands trembling as he pressed down on the wound. "We can't stay here," he said through clenched teeth. "If there's one, there are more." Sarah's chest burned, torn between the fear of moving him and the certainty that staying meant death. She looked at Lily, who was clutching Rex's collar, tears streaking down her frozen cheeks. "Mom, we can't leave him." Sarah met her daughter's pleading gaze. She felt the wall inside her shatter completely. "We're not leaving him." Her eyes swept the tree line, and there, a shadow of a structure barely visible through the blowing snow. A hunting cabin, old and forgotten, but standing. "Come on," she said fiercely. "Help me!" Together they lifted Rex gently, Sarah carrying most of his weight as Daniel staggered beside her, still weak but refusing to fall. Lily ran ahead, pushing open the warped door of the cabin. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, stale from years of abandonment, but the roof held and the walls shielded them from the storm. It was enough. Sarah lowered Rex onto a dusty old rug, her breath ragged, her hands already moving. She dumped the contents of her veterinary kit onto the floor: scissors, gauze, antiseptic, a needle and thread, meant for emergencies. Not for this. Not for shrapnel tearing into muscle. Daniel knelt on the other side, his jaw tight as he tried to help, though his own body shook with exhaustion. Lily crouched close, her small hands gently stroking Rex's head, whispering, "It's okay, boy. You're going to be okay." Sarah took a deep breath, forcing down the panic clawing at her throat. "I need light." Lily held the flashlight steady. Her daughter obeyed instantly, her little hands trembling as the beam cut across the wound. Sarah's stomach lurched at the sight, the gash deep, the blood too dark, the jagged metal embedded in the muscle. She swallowed hard, her instincts as a vet roaring back to life. "We don't have a choice. If I don't get this out, he won't make it." Daniel's eyes met hers. "You can do this." Sarah's fingers shook as she sterilized the scissors in the flame of a match. She'd done this before for animals brought into her clinic after car accidents, after farm injuries. But this wasn't just any patient. This was Rex. And somewhere deep inside, she knew saving him meant more than saving a dog. It meant saving the last thread of hope holding them together. "Easy, boy," she whispered as she began. Rex whimpered, his body tense, but still his amber eyes never leaving her face. She worked with precision, sweat beading on her forehead despite the freezing air. The shard of metal was lodged deep. She gritted her teeth, pushing through the resistance as the tool clamped around it. Rex let out a sharp cry, his body jerking, and Lily gasped. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "Stay with me, Rex. Just a little longer." Finally, with a sickening scrape, the metal slid free. Blood poured faster now, and Sarah moved quickly, packing the wound with gauze stitching as fast as her freezing fingers allowed. Daniel pressed firm pressure on the wound when she asked, his face pale, but his resolve iron. "He's a fighter," he said hoarsely. Sarah's eyes burned. "So am I." When the last stitch was tied, Sarah sagged back, her hands coated in blood, her heart pounding like a drum. She pressed her forehead gently against Rex's, her voice breaking. "You did it. You held on." Rex licked her cheek weakly, and for a moment Sarah forgot the storm, the hunters, the fear. All that mattered was that he was still alive. Lily threw her arms around her mother, sobbing softly. "You saved him, Mom." Sarah held her daughter close, her hand resting on Rex's head. She had thought she was too broken to save anyone again. But tonight, in this frozen hunting cabin with danger pressing at their door, she had chosen to fight, and as Rex's steady breathing calmed, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in a long time. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were holding on to each other. Outside, the storm howled, and somewhere in the trees, the men who wanted them dead moved closer. But Sarah no longer felt powerless. She had her daughter. She had Daniel. She had Rex, and she was ready to fight. The hunting cabin had grown eerily quiet, its silence broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire in the stove and the whistling of wind against the warped shutters. The walls smelled of old wood and rust, a place that had once sheltered hunters but now carried the weight of desperation. Daniel sat propped against the wall, his face pale under the dim glow of the lantern Sarah had managed to coax to life. The firelight flickered across his features, tracing the lines of pain and exhaustion. His breathing was shallow, every inhale tight with discomfort. Rex lay curled at his side, his stitched leg wrapped in gauze, his body trembling with fatigue, yet eyes unyielding amber orbs fixed on the door like a sentinel, refusing to falter. Sarah crouched near the stove, her back tense, her eyes locked on the flames, as though drawing strength from their warmth. Lily, wrapped in a tattered blanket, sat beside Rex, her small hand resting gently on his fur, her young face etched with a maturity no child should bear. For a long time, none of them spoke. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Then Daniel's voice broke it low and strained. "This isn't right," he murmured almost to himself. Sarah turned, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Daniel met her gaze, his eyes shadowed with guilt. "You and Lily. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be in this fight. I've dragged you into something that's not yours to bear." Sarah's jaw tightened. She rose slowly, her voice steady but edged with fire. "Dragged us? You think we had a choice?" Daniel looked away, shame flickering across his face. "You could have stayed behind. You could have run when you had the chance. Now you're caught in the crosshairs of men who won't stop until I'm dead." Sarah stepped closer, her anger sharpening with every word. "And leave you to die out there. Leave that dog to bleed out in the snow. That's not who we are. That's not who." Her voice cracked at the edges, raw and furious. "You think you're the only one with something to lose? You think Lily and I don't know what it's like to have death breathing down our necks? Daniel's eyes snapped back to hers, startled by the force in her tone. My husband died 3 years ago. Sarah continued, her voice trembling now, the rage tangled with grief. A drunk driver took him in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. And you know what I learned? That you can do everything right. Follow every rule, pray every night, and life still tears away the people you love. So don't you dare stand there and tell me I don't get a say in whether we fight to live. The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Lily's eyes brimmed with tears as she clutched Rex tighter, her small shoulders trembling. Daniel's chest rose sharply, guilt washing over his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah wasn't finished. I've been walking through this world half alive, ever since she said, her eyes burning. Trying to be enough for my daughter, while drowning in the silence of a house that used to be full of laughter. Tonight, for the first time in years, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. Because saving you, saving Rex, it reminded me that I'm not powerless, that I can still fight. Her voice softened, breaking just slightly. So don't you dare take that from me. The silence that followed was thick, trembling with the weight of truths neither of them had spoken aloud until now. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached down, brushing Rex's fur. The dog stirred, lifting his head, his eyes flicking between the two humans as if sensing every unspoken word. You're right, Daniel said finally, his voice quiet, raw. He looked up at her, his eyes shining in the dim light. I've spent so long believing it was my job to carry the weight to shield everyone else. And all it's done is bury me deeper. Carter's blood is on my hands. Rourke's betrayal. It's like a knife I can't pull out. And now? He glanced at Lily, his throat tightening. I don't want more innocent blood because of me. Sarah's gaze softened, the fury melting into something deeper. Something that looked dangerously like understanding. Daniel, she whispered, stepping closer. This isn't just about you anymore. We're in this together. Whether you like it or not, we're a team now. At that, Rex let out a low, rumbling whine, his ears flicking as if to agree. Lily leaned into his side, nodding fiercely. She's right, the girl said, her voice small but unyielding. You're not alone. Not anymore. Daniel's throat worked as he swallowed hard. For the first time since the night began, the wall of guilt and stoicism cracked. His eyes glistened, his hand resting firmly on Rex's head as though anchoring himself. Rex shifted, nudging Daniel's arm, then turned his gaze toward Lily. The dog let out a soft, steady bark. Nothing loud, nothing frantic, just enough to remind them all he was there, watching, listening. A guardian in fur and blood. Sarah knelt beside Rex, her hand brushing his neck gently. He knows, she whispered. He knows we're stronger together. Daniel let out a shaky laugh that sounded almost like a sob. A dog's got more sense than I do. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Sometimes they do. The tension in the cabin shifted, no longer sharp enough to cut, but heavy enough to weigh them down. For the first time, they weren't three strangers thrown together by chance. They were bound by blood spilled by choices made by loyalty they hadn't expected, but couldn't deny. Sarah sat back, drawing Lily against her side. We're going to get through this, she said softly, her words carrying the force of a vow. Not just survive it. We're going to make it home. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes steady on hers. Then we fight. Together. Rex's tail thumped weakly against the rug, the sound small but powerful in the silence. The storm raged on outside the night, deepening the threat, pressing closer with every heartbeat. But inside that fragile shelter, for the first time, they weren't just survivors running from death. They were a team. A family forged in the crucible of fear and fire. And none of them, man, woman, child, or dog, intended to let go. The cabin's air had grown heavy, the crackling fire long gone cold, leaving only the faint glow of embers in the stove. Every creak of the wooden walls, every whistle of the wind outside pressed against their nerves like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah sat near the window, peering through a sliver in the shutters. Her breath fogged the glass as she searched the tree line for movement. Daniel, still pale and weakened from blood loss, leaned against the wall, his revolver resting loosely in his lap. He had insisted on keeping it within reach, though his trembling hands betrayed just how fragile his strength was. Lily slept fitfully on the rug beside Rex, her hand still clutching the dog's collar, even in dreams, as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. Rex's ears twitched suddenly. He lifted his head, his body stiffening. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Sarah froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. What is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's gaze sharpened, following Rex's stare toward the door. Someone's here, he said quietly. The calmness in his tone masking the dread in his eyes. The seconds stretched painfully. Then a faint crunch of boots in the snow outside. Slow, deliberate steps. The sound of death drawing closer. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She scanned the cabin desperately. No time to flee, no place to hide. The footsteps stopped. A shadow passed across the window. Then the door handle rattled softly, testing. Daniel motioned quickly, his voice a rasp. "We make it look abandoned. Don't move, don't breathe." The door creaked as it pushed open a few inches. The bitter wind swept inside, carrying flakes of snow that swirled through the dim cabin light. A figure slipped through the gap. A man tall and broad-shouldered, his breath steaming in the cold. A rifle glinted in his gloved hands. His eyes swept the room with the precision of a predator pausing on the stove, the blankets the faint imprint of feet in the dust. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she feared it would give them away. She crouched lower behind the broken chair near the wall, clutching the length of rusted iron pipe she had pulled from the cabin earlier. Her palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. The man stepped further inside, scanning with predatory patience. "I know you're in here," he said softly, his voice dark and cruel. "You can't hide from us." Sheriff Hayes doesn't walk away this time. Daniel's jaw clenched, but his eyes never left Sarah. With a faint motion of his hand, he gestured to the corner near the old woodpile. Sarah followed his gaze and spotted what he meant. A loose board partially balanced the perfect noise trap if someone stepped wrong. Her breath hitched. He was telling her to lure the man into it. The intruder advanced slowly, boots crunching against the wooden floorboards. Rex's growl deepened, but Daniel whispered hoarsely, "Not yet." Sarah's mind raced. Fear clawed at her throat, but beneath it burned something sharper resolve. This was no longer about waiting to be found. It was about proving they weren't prey. She shifted slightly, just enough to brush against a can on the floor, sending it rolling toward the far side of the cabin. The sound clattered in the silence. The intruder's head snapped toward it instantly. He moved in that direction, his weight shifting right onto the loose board. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The man stumbled, swearing under his breath, his balance faltering for just a second. It was enough. Sarah surged forward with the iron pipe clenched in both hands. Her arm swung with all the force desperation could muster, striking the rifle clean from his grasp. The weapon clattered across the floor. The man roared, spinning toward her, his face twisted in rage. "You little—" Before he could finish, Sarah swung again this time, catching him square across the jaw. The blow sent him reeling backward, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Rex lunged, then despite his injured leg teeth snapping dangerously close to the man's arm. The intruder jerked away, shouting in panic, but Sarah was already on him, pressing the iron pipe against his chest. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her entire body trembling with adrenaline. Daniel, though weak, forced himself to his feet, grabbing the fallen rifle. He leveled it at the man, his eyes cold steel. "Don't move!" He growled, his voice hoarse but deadly. The intruder froze, chest heaving. His eyes darted from Daniel to Sarah to Rex, calculating, realizing too late that his element of surprise had turned against him. Sarah's arms shook as she pressed harder. For a fleeting second, she saw herself reflected in his terrified eyes. Not the broken widow she had been, but a mother, a fighter, someone who would burn the world down before letting her daughter fall into these men's hands. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. "Who else is out there?" The man sneered despite his position. "You think this changes anything? You kill me and my brothers, we'll bury you all before sunrise." Sarah's voice cut through, steady and fierce. "Then maybe we don't wait for sunrise." The words hung in the air, electric and dangerous. Daniel glanced at her, something sparking in his tired eyes. The doubt that had weighed on him earlier was gone. In its place was grim acceptance. "She's right," he said, his gaze never leaving the intruder. "We can't keep running. We need to fight back." The man laughed bitterly, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Sarah slammed the pipe harder against his chest, her voice rising raw with fury. "You don't get to decide that." For a moment's silence. The storm outside screamed against the cabin walls, but inside the only sounds were the rapid breathing of 3 humans and 1 dog, hearts beating in unison. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "Tie him," he ordered softly. Sarah blinked, her hands still trembling, but she nodded. With Lily's spare blanket, she bound the man's wrists, the fabric pulling tight under her grip. Rex sat close, a low growl still rumbling. His gaze locked on the prisoner as though daring him to try anything. When it was done, Daniel lowered the rifle slightly, his chest heaving. He looked at Sarah, and for a brief second, the weight of everything lifted. He saw her not as the grieving widow or the terrified mother. but as the woman who had just saved their lives. "You did good," he said quietly. Sarah swallowed hard, adrenaline still flooding her veins. "We can't hide here anymore," she whispered, glancing at Lily, who clung to Rex, her eyes wide but full of fierce pride. "They'll keep coming, and next time there'll be more." Daniel nodded grimly. "Then we take the fight to them." The decision settled over the cabin like a vow, unspoken yet undeniable. They were no longer running. They were preparing. Sarah's grip tightened on the pipe, her eyes steady. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was ready to fight back. And as the storm raged on outside, the fragile makeshift family inside the cabin realized something that would carry them through the night. They were no longer just a woman, a child, a wounded sheriff, and a battered dog. They were a force. And the men hunting them had no idea what was coming. The cabin smelled of smoke and sweat, the air thick with tension that hadn't lifted even after the intruder was bound and gagged in the corner. Outside, the storm's fury had quieted into a deceptive hush, the kind of silence that felt less like mercy and more like the mountain holding its breath. Sarah sat near the dying embers, her eyes sharp and restless, fingers fidgeting against the iron pipe still sticky with the warmth of her courage. Daniel leaned heavily against the wall, his injuries gnawing at him, yet his gaze followed her every move. Lily nestled against Rex, the Malinois curled around her like a sentinel, his golden eyes flickering open at every stray sound. They all knew it, the brief reprieve wouldn't last. The others would come. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice low but steady, laced with the steel of decision. "We can't just wait for them to find us again. Next time there will be more of them. They'll come prepared." Daniel studied her exhaustion in his eyes. "But something else too, respect." "You're right. But what are you suggesting? We're outgunned, outnumbered, and running on fumes?" Sarah leaned closer, her eyes catching the faint glow from the embers. "We don't fight them on their terms. We fight them on the mountains." Daniel frowned. The mountains, her jaw tightened. She had lived in Silver Creek her whole life, knew the trails, the cliffs, the places where even hunters feared to tread. She drew a line in the dust on the floor with her fingertip, marking out a rough sketch. "There's a ravine about 2 miles east, narrow, steep, and unstable in weather like this. The ice is thinning. A well-placed trigger, even something as small as a rifle shot, could bring down enough snow to bury half an army." Daniel's eyes widened. He looked from the crude drawing to Sarah's face. "You're talking about starting a controlled avalanche." She nodded once. "If we can draw them into that pass, we might have a chance." Silence fell heavy again. Even Lily, wide-eyed, understood the weight of the plan. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head slowly. "It's dangerous. Avalanches don't come with guarantees. We could get caught in it ourselves." Sarah met his gaze, her green eyes burning with the same quiet ferocity that had driven her to crack a pipe against a killer's skull hours earlier. "Everything about this is dangerous, but waiting here is suicide. If they find us huddled in this cabin, there won't be anything left to fight for." Daniel rubbed his jaw, the stubble rough under his fingertips. For the first time, he wasn't the one giving orders, he was listening. Rex let out a low whine, pushing his muzzle against Daniel's hand, as if urging him toward agreement. Finally, Daniel nodded slowly, a grim smile tugging faintly at the corner of his lips. "All right. We make the mountain our weapon, but we'll need bait." Sarah's pulse quickened. "I'll do it." Lily shot upright, her voice sharp with fear. "No." Sarah turned to her daughter, her hand brushing Lily's hair back, smoothing the strands damp with sweat. "Sweetheart, we don't have a choice. If we don't end this tonight, they'll come again. They'll never stop." Her voice softened, breaking through her own fear. "I promised your father I'd always protect you. And I meant it." Tears welled in Lily's eyes, but she didn't argue. She only held tighter to Rex's collar, as though the dog could keep her mother from vanishing into the storm. Daniel's voice cut through, gently but firm. "We all play a part. Sarah, you know the terrain. I can still shoot. And Rex." He glanced down at the dog whose injured leg trembled, yet whose eyes burned with relentless fire. "Rex will make sure none of us stand alone." Sarah drew a deep breath. "Then it's settled." They spent the next hour preparing, every movement deliberate, every second stolen from the ticking clock of death. Daniel loaded the rifle with careful, trembling hands, checking each round twice. Sarah gathered the few supplies from the cabin, an old lantern rope, a hatchet dulled with time. She packed strips of torn fabric for bandages, her vet's instincts knowing the night could demand them. And through it all, Lily helped quietly, her small hands, steady as she bundled the supplies, her eyes shining not with fear now, but with determination. She had grown up tonight, forged in fire and snow. When they were ready, Sarah crouched in front of her daughter. "Stay close to me. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you don't let go. Lily nodded, pressing her forehead to Sarah's shoulder. I won't. Rex nosed between them, tail thumping weakly, a silent promise in his amber eyes. Outside, the night stretched wide and merciless. The wind had calmed, leaving a brittle stillness that made every sound echo. Their breaths rose in sharp clouds as they stepped into the snow, the crunch of boots sounding far too loud in the silence. Daniel leaned heavily on Sarah as they moved, though he never once complained. The sheriff in him refused to be dead weight, even if his body threatened to betray him. Rex limped ahead, his nose-low ears pricked, guiding them with the precision of a soldier. His paw prints painted the snow in streaks of crimson, but he never faltered. By the time they reached the edge of the ravine, the moon had broken through thin clouds, casting a ghostly glow on the ice-slick walls. The pass loomed narrow and treacherous, the kind of place where one wrong step could echo as an avalanche. Sarah pointed across the gap. There. That ridge. It's loose. If we can get them beneath it, one shot will set it off. Daniel surveyed the terrain, his sharp eyes measuring distances, angles, risks. And us, she swallowed hard. We'll already be past the ridge hidden in the rock hollow. It'll be close, but... Her voice trailed the unspoken truth hanging heavy. But if they miscalculated, they'd all be buried. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, steady despite the tremor in his grip. Then we won't miscalculate. They moved quickly, setting their trap in silence. Sarah climbed the ridge with Lily's help, planting the rope and lanterns as markers. Daniel steadied his rifle, his breath controlled, waiting for the faintest echo of pursuit. And then, faint but unmistakable, it came, the distant hum of an engine. Headlights flickered through the trees. Sarah's pulse thundered. They were coming. She crouched beside Lily, her voice a whisper of steel. Remember what I said. Stay with me. Always. The girl nodded, clutching Rex as if he were her anchor in the storm. The first shadow emerged at the mouth of the ravine. Voices followed, mocking, cruel, carried on the wind. Daniel raised the rifle, his eyes sharp on the sight. Not yet. Sarah whispered, her hand steady on his arm. Wait until they're all in. The men fanned into the pass, their laughter echoing against the icy walls, oblivious to the trap above them. The snow above the ridge shivered delicate as glass waiting to shatter. Sarah's breath caught. The moment was here. Now, she whispered. Daniel's shot cracked through the silence, echoing like thunder. The mountain answered. A roar split the night as the ridge above them gave way, tons of snow and ice crashing down in a tidal wave of white. The men's shouts turned to screams as the avalanche swallowed them whole, their rifles vanishing beneath the crushing force of nature unleashed. Sarah pulled Lily close, shielding her with her body as the tremors shook the ground. Rex pressed against them, his body rigid, ears flat as the world roared. And then silence. Heavy, absolute silence. The ravine lay buried under a mountain of snow, smooth and untouched, as if the men had never existed. Sarah's chest heaved. She looked at Daniel, whose face was pale but resolute. He lowered the rifle slowly, his breath steaming in the cold air. We did it, he said softly, disbelief flickering in his eyes. But Sarah shook her head, her gaze hard, unflinching. No. We survived. But it's not over. Lily pressed her face into her mother's coat, whispering against the fabric. You promised, Mom. You said you'd protect me. Sarah kissed the crown of her daughter's head, her voice fierce with conviction. And I will. Always. Rex nudged Daniel's hand, his muzzle streaked with snow, amber eyes burning with loyalty. Daniel managed a faint smile, scratching behind the dog's ears. You saved us again, buddy. As they turned away from the ravine, leaving behind the white grave of their hunters, Sarah felt something shift within her. For the first time since her husband's death, she wasn't walking alone in the storm. She had a purpose, a family, and a reason to fight. And though the mountain had claimed their enemies tonight, she knew more shadows waited beyond the trees. But now, for the first time, she didn't fear them. Because together, Sarah, Lily, Daniel, and Rex, they had become more than survivors. They had become a force. The mountain's silence after the avalanche was deceptive, a silence that felt earned, almost holy. But the reprieve didn't last. It never did. The storm may have buried the hunters, but there was one man it hadn't touched, one man too cunning to be caught by falling snow. Sarah felt it first. A shift in the air, a presence heavy enough to send the hairs on her neck standing on end. Rex sensed it too. His ears pricked, his low growl rumbling deep in his chest, not the uncertain whimper of fear, but the guttural warning of a predator meeting another. Daniel, leaning against a boulder, his rifle balanced in trembling hands, froze. His eyes narrowed, scanning the tree line. Then he saw it, a dark figure emerging from the shadows of the pines, slow, deliberate, carrying himself with the calm arrogance of a man who believed he'd already won. The lantern's glow caught his face, and Daniel's blood ran cold. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice fraying. Sarah turned sharply. "Who is it?" Daniel's lips tightened into a grim line, his eyes locked on the man, now stepping closer, snow crunching beneath his boots. "Captain Jansen," Daniel said hoarsely. "My old CO, my brother in everything but blood." The man stopped just short of the lantern's reach, the light sketching half his face, sharp jawline cold, blue eyes that once inspired loyalty, now dripping with contempt. His breath came slow and steady. No fear, no rush, only certainty. "Well," Jansen said, his voice smooth, almost casual. "I was starting to wonder if you'd managed to crawl out of that hole I left you in, Danny." The familiarity of the nickname cut deeper than any blade. Daniel's fingers tightened around the rifle, but the pain in his side made the barrel tremble. "You," Daniel rasped. "You killed them. All of them." Jansen tilted his head, smirk curling on his lips. "Killed, no. I cleaned up. There's a difference. You should have been smarter. Should have looked the other way, like you were told." Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped closer to Lily, shielding her daughter with her body. She studied the man, noting the calm steadiness of his hands, the way his eyes flickered not to Daniel, but to the girl standing behind him. A hunter, assessing prey. "You used to protect this town," Daniel said, his voice cracking but firm. "We trusted you." Jansen's smirk deepened. "Trust is a funny thing. People put you on a pedestal, call you a hero. But when you figure out that medals don't pay bills, loyalty starts to look a lot like stupidity." He let the words hang in the icy air before adding, "I told you once, Danny. The world doesn't care about men like us. But money talks." Daniel's eyes burned with fury, the betrayal fresh raw. "You were supposed to be better than this." "Better," Jansen laughed softly, the sound hollow and sharp. "Better got my men killed overseas while I followed rules made by cowards. Better left me scraping by while corrupt officials lined their pockets. I'm done being better." The venom in his words cut Sarah deeper than she expected. She saw in him not just a criminal, but a man who had chosen bitterness over honor, greed over grace. Jansen's eyes slid toward Lily, the smirk curling into something colder. "And this is the girl?" His voice dropped almost a whisper. "Cute kid. Shame she's seen too much." Sarah's blood ran cold. Instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The ravine at their backs, the open snow at their front. Trapped. "Don't you touch her," Sarah hissed, her voice sharp as steel. Jansen ignored her, his gaze still on Lily. Then he raised his pistol, slow, deliberate. Daniel lunged forward despite the pain, shouting no. The shot rang out, cracking the frozen night wide open. But it never reached Lily. Rex exploded forward, a blur of muscle and fur launching himself between the gun and the girl. The bullet tore into his flank and the dog collapsed against the snow with a pained yelp that sliced through the air like a scream. Rex, Lily shrieked, falling to her knees beside him, her small hands pressing desperately against the wound. The world froze for Sarah. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in her ears, but all she could see was Rex lying in the snow, his amber eyes dimming yet still locked on Lily, as if willing her to be safe. Something inside Sarah snapped. The fear that had haunted her since her husband's death. The grief that had chained her heart, all of it ignited into a fire so fierce it consumed the cold. She surged to her feet, grabbing the iron pipe she'd carried since the cabin. Her voice ripped through the night, raw and trembling with rage. "You bastard!" Jansen turned, his smirk faltering for the first time as Sarah charged. He raised the pistol again, but Daniel, fueled by rage and betrayal, slammed into him from the side. The two men crashed into the snow, the gun skittering across the ice. The fight was brutal, primal. Daniel's strength faltered under the weight of his injuries, but sheer fury drove his fists. Jansen fought back with the cold precision of a trained soldier, every blow calculated, every strike aimed to end it quickly. Sarah swung the pipe, the metal ringing against Johnson's arm, breaking his rhythm. He snarled, shoving Daniel aside, his eyes flashing with murderous intent. "You don't know what you're doing, woman." Jansen spat, his voice dripping venom. Sarah's chest heaved, her grip white-knuckled on the pipe. "I know exactly what I'm doing. Protecting my family." The word family hung in the air. And for the first time, Jansen's expression cracked, his eyes flickering with something like disbelief. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by cold rage. He lunged at her, but Daniel, blood streaking his temple, dragged himself up, tackling him again. The two men rolled in the snow grunts and the crack of fists filling the night. Lily sobbed softly, cradling Rex's head, whispering through her tears. "Hold on, boy. Please hold on." The Malinois, though bleeding heavily, let out a weak whine, pressing his muzzle into her hands, as if to reassure her even now. Sarah's chest ached at the sight. No, she thought fiercely, not again. I won't lose anyone else. Jansen finally gained the upper hand, pinning Daniel down, his fist raised high for a killing blow. His voice roared through the cold. You should have stayed buried, Danny. Before the strike could fall, Sarah swung the pipe with everything she had. It connected with a sickening crack against Jansen's shoulder, sending him sprawling sideways. Daniel gasped, seizing the moment to roll free. Sarah stood over Jansen, her chest-heaving pipe raised again. Her green eyes blazed with a fury that shook even him. You'll never touch her. You'll never hurt him. Not while I'm breathing. Jansen smirked faintly despite the blood trickling from his temple. Then you'd better be ready to kill me. Daniel, shaking, dragged himself upright, his rifle once again in his hands. He aimed it squarely at his former captain. No, Daniel said hoarsely. We're done playing by your rules. For the first time, Johnson's eyes wavered, but he masked it quickly with a cold sneer. You don't have the guts. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, the weight of years of loyalty and betrayal pressing down. His voice broke, but his aim didn't. Maybe not before. But you made sure I do now. The crack of the rifle shattered the night. Jansen's body collapsed into the snow, the arrogance draining from his face as the mountain swallowed the last echo of his breath. Silence fell heavy and absolute. Sarah dropped the pipe, her hands trembling violently. She rushed to Lily, kneeling beside her daughter and Rex. Blood soaked the snow around the Malinois, his breaths shallow, each one a battle. Sarah pressed her hands to the wound, her voice desperate. Stay with me, Rex. Stay with her. Lily clung to the dog, tears streaking her face. He saved me, Mom. He saved me. Daniel knelt beside them, his eyes glassy, his voice choked. He's a fighter. Don't count him out yet. Sarah looked into Rex's fading eyes, saw the loyalty, the love, the unbreakable will that had carried them through the storm. She whispered fiercely, You're not leaving us. Not now. Not ever. The night held its breath, and in that fragile, aching silence, hope flickered thin, trembling, but alive. The mountain seemed to roar as if the storm itself had taken sides. The once silent snowfall became an avalanche of chaos bullets cracking through the night. The crunch of boots against hardened ice and the guttural echoes of men shouting in the storm. The final confrontation had arrived, not with quiet dread, but with the fury of a world splitting apart. Sarah gripped the iron pipe, her knuckles white against the freezing metal, her breath billowing in ragged bursts. Daniel, pale and bloodied, forced himself to his feet, rifle clutched tight, his body trembling with both weakness and resolve. The snow around them was stained with patches of crimson. Rex's blood, Daniel's blood, the price of defiance. And Lily, her small figure wrapped in her too large coat, clung desperately to Rex, refusing to let go despite the cold gnawing at her tiny frame. From the tree line, figures emerged, dark silhouettes against the blinding white. The surviving men, Jansen's crew faces, hardened eyes glinting like predators cornering prey. Their voices carried in the wind. There they are. Don't let them out alive. The words were more than a threat. They were a promise. Daniel lifted his rifle, his voice hoarse but commanding. Sarah, get behind cover. Lily, stay low. But Sarah didn't move. Her eyes blazed a fire born of loss, love, and fury. No, I'm not running anymore. The first gunshot split the air, spraying snow where Sarah had just stood. Daniel returned fire instantly, the crack of his rifle sharp and unyielding. One of the men staggered, falling into the snow with a guttural cry. The others pressed forward, undeterred, their boots digging into the icy slope. Rex let out a low growl, dragging himself upright, despite the wound in his flank. He limped ahead of Lily, teeth bared, positioning himself between her and the danger. His amber eyes, dimmed by pain, still burned with a loyalty stronger than any command. Stay with me, boy, Lily whispered, clutching his fur with trembling hands. Don't leave me. Another volley of gunfire ripped through the storm. Daniel ducked, firing back, his vision swimming with exhaustion. Beside him, Sarah darted forward, grabbing a fallen pistol, half buried in the snow. Her hands shook, but her aim didn't waver. The men advanced closer, shouting orders, their shadows growing larger as they closed the gap. Then the ground trembled. A low, groaning sound rolled beneath their feet. The avalanche trap Sarah and Daniel had feared and planned was awakening. Daniel, Sarah shouted over the wind, the ridge. He followed her gaze. High above them, snow had begun to shift, breaking in fractured lines. The storm's fury and the men's gunfire had triggered the unstable slope. It was moments away from collapse. The men didn't notice. Their eyes were locked on Sarah, Daniel, and the child clinging to the wounded dog. Sarah's chest heaved. We use it. Now. Daniel nodded grimly. On my mark. The enemy surged forward. Daniel raised his rifle, fired a shot, not at the men, but at the ridge above. The crack echoed like thunder, and the mountainside groaned in response. A wall of snow broke free, roaring down the slope with a force no man could outrun. "Run," Daniel bellowed. Sarah seized Lily's hand, pulling her away from the clearing, while Rex limped beside them, driven by sheer will. Behind them, chaos erupted as the men shouted, their voices swallowed by the deafening roar of the avalanche. One by one, they disappeared into the white torrent, swept away by nature's merciless hand. But not all of them. From the chaos, one figure broke free, sprinting with desperate fury. The last man standing. The traitor. Jansen's right hand, a hulking brute with cold eyes and a scar running down his cheek, locked onto them like a wolf scenting blood. He raised his rifle, firing wildly as he ran, each shot striking closer to Sarah and Lily. Daniel spun, returning fire. The man stumbled, hit, but not stopped. His rage fueled him, carrying him forward even as blood darkened his coat. Sarah shoved Lily behind a fallen tree trunk, her own pistol trembling in her grasp. She fired. The shot grazed the man's shoulder, spinning him slightly. But he kept coming, teeth bared in a snarl. "Run!" Sarah Daniel shouted, limping forward to block the man's path. "No," she screamed back, her voice breaking with both terror and resolve. "We finish this. Together." The man charged, slamming into Daniel with brutal force. They crashed into the snow, grappling for the rifle fists and fury flying. Daniel grunted in pain as the traitor's elbow drove into his wounded side, white-hot agony flashing through him. Sarah raised the pistol again, but the two men rolled, bodies tangled, leaving her no clear shot. Her chest heaved, panic clawing at her throat. Then Lily's cry pierced the chaos. "Mom, Rex, he's stuck." Sarah whipped around. Snow from the avalanche had partially buried Rex, his body struggling against the weight. Lily clawed at the snow with her small hands, sobbing. "Don't leave me, Rex. Don't leave me." Sarah's heart split. Two battles, one choice. "Daniel," she cried. He looked at her, blood streaking his face, eyes blazing with pain and defiance. "Save them. I'll hold him." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. She dropped to her knees beside Rex, shoving snow away with frantic hands. "Stay with us, boy. Please." Lily pressed her face against Rex's muzzle, whispering through tears. "Don't go. Don't leave me alone." With a final heave, Sarah freed him, pulling his trembling body into her lap. Rex let out a weak, pained whine, his eyes finding Lily's as if to promise he wasn't giving up. Behind them, Daniel roared, slamming the traitor into the snow. The man fought back with vicious strength, his hands closing around Daniel's throat. The world blurred at the edges for Daniel, the weight of betrayal pressing down harder than the man's grip. Sarah looked up, her breath ragged, and saw the ground beneath the traitor's shifting cracks, splitting through the snow. The avalanche's aftershock had weakened the ridge. "Daniel," she screamed. "The ground." He twisted, using the last of his strength to shove the man sideways. The traitor's eyes widened as the snow beneath him gave way, the white earth crumbling into the yawning chasm below. For a heartbeat, he clung to the edge, his gaze locking on Daniel's. Fury burned in his eyes. "You think you've won? This isn't over." Then the snow collapsed, and he fell, his scream echoing through the ravine before the storm swallowed it whole. Silence, the kind that didn't come from peace, but from the breathless aftermath of death, narrowly avoided. Daniel collapsed back into the snow, gasping for air. Sarah crawled to him, her arms wrapping around Lily, and Rex pulling them all close in a shivering, tear-streaked embrace. They had survived. Barely. The storm howled above them. But for the first time, it sounded less like a predator and more like a hymn, wild, fierce, but carrying the echo of hope. Sarah pressed her forehead against Lily's hair, whispering, "It's over, baby. We're safe now." But in her chest, she knew it wasn't over. Not entirely. The mountain had taken their hunters, but shadows lingered, and the road back to Silver Creek was still long. Yet as Rex stirred weakly, pressing his muzzle into Lily's chest, Sarah felt something ignite inside her. They were no longer just survivors. They were a family, and together they would find their way home. The storm had finally begun to break, but the mountain still groaned with the weight of the night's battle. The once merciless wind softened into a weary hush, carrying with it the faint hum of approaching rotors. At first, Sarah thought it was her imagination, a desperate hallucination after hours of fear and exhaustion. But then the sound grew louder, cutting through the dawn like a promise. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, his face bloodied and pale against the snow. He turned his head slowly, forcing a broken smile. "That's rescue," he whispered, his voice hoarse, as though the word itself was a fragile miracle he barely believed in. Sarah tightened her arm around Lily, her own body trembling with relief and disbelief. Beside them, Rex let out a faint whine, his muzzle pressed weakly against Lily's chest. His breathing was shallow, uneven, every rise of his ribs a battle of its own. Lily's tears fell silently into the thick fur, her small hands stroking him, as though the touch alone could keep him tethered to this world. The rescue helicopter burst through the pale cloud's blades, slicing the frozen air. Snow whipped around them in furious spirals as the craft hovered above the clearing, a lifeline descending into their nightmare. "Over here," Sarah shouted, her voice, breaking arms waving wildly, despite the pain burning through her muscles. Her cries were swallowed by the thundering rotors, but the crew had already seen them. A figure in bright orange leaned out, signaling as the rope harness dropped toward the ground. Daniel tried to push himself upright, but his body betrayed him, collapsing back into the snow. Sarah's hand caught his arm. "Don't," she said firmly, tears streaking down her face. "You've done enough." The rescue crew reached them within seconds, boots sinking deep into the snow. "We've got you," one of them shouted, kneeling beside Daniel and checking his pulse with swift precision. Another reached for Rex, but Lily cried out, clutching the dog tighter. "Careful, please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. The rescuer softened his tone. "We'll take care of him, I promise." It took all of Lily's strength to let go, her small fingers trembling as she released Rex into the medic's arms. His blood stained her gloves, his warmth slipping away, and she sobbed into Sarah's coat, whispering, "Don't let him die, Mom. Please." Sarah kissed the top of her daughter's head, holding her close, as her own tears blurred the world. "We won't let him go, baby. We won't." Daniel, strapped into a stretcher, caught Sarah's gaze as the harness began to lift him skyward. His lips moved around words too faint for the crew to hear, but Sarah understood. "Thank you." She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. One by one, they were hoisted into the helicopter. Sarah clutched Lily against her chest, her eyes never leaving Rex as the crew fought to stabilize him. The Malinois' fur was matted with crimson, his eyes half closed, but even in his weakness, his gaze found hers, as if asking her to keep the promise she hadn't yet spoken aloud. The helicopter surged forward, carrying them away from the treacherous ridges and into the pale light of morning. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah allowed herself to believe they might live through this. Yet the weight of what lay ahead pressed against her chest. Safety was not the same as peace. The hospital in Silver Creek glowed like a beacon against the frozen landscape, its windows spilling warm light into the biting morning air. The moment the helicopter touched down, medical teams swarmed forward, rushing stretchers inside. Sarah clung to Lily as they followed the gurney carrying Rex. The sight of him, fur shaved around the wound, IV lines already being inserted, made her chest ache as if someone had reached inside and twisted her heart. "Critical one," nurse murmured. "We'll do everything we can." Sarah reached for Rex's paw as they wheeled him toward the operating room. "You're not leaving us," she whispered fiercely, her tears dripping onto his fur. "Do you hear me? You're not leaving." Lily stood beside her, small hands balled into fists. "He's a hero, Mom. Heroes don't die." The words broke Sarah's heart because she had once believed the same about her husband. And yet, she tightened her grip on Lily's hand. "Not this time," she said, her voice trembling. "Not him." In another room, Daniel was being treated, his wounds cleaned and bandaged, his ribs wrapped tightly. The young sheriff stared at the ceiling, his eyes unfocused, hearing the muffled chaos outside his door. He had lost everything, his badge, his brothers in uniform, the trust of the town he had sworn to protect. But when the door opened and Sarah stepped inside with Lily at her side, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. "Daniel," Sarah said softly, pulling a chair to his bedside. "They said you'll recover." He gave a faint, humorless chuckle. "Physically, maybe." His voice cracked raw with weariness. "But the rest..." He turned his head toward the window where the faint glow of dawn pressed against the glass. "I'm not sure I know who I am without that badge." Sarah's gaze softened, though her own exhaustion carved shadows beneath her eyes. "Maybe who you are isn't about a badge." She reached across, laying her hand gently over his. "Maybe it's about what you do when no one's watching. And you saved us. That's more than enough." His throat tightened, eyes burning with unspoken emotion. For a long moment, silence hung between them, heavy with grief and fragile hope. Then Lily slipped forward, her small voice breaking the quiet. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered, clutching the edge of his blanket, "Rex needs you. So you can't give up. Not yet." Daniel's gaze shifted, meeting the girl's eyes. They were so much like her mother's, bright, unwavering, even through the fear. He managed a faint smile, the corners of his lips trembling. "I'll try, Lily. I promise." Hours stretched into a blur. Nurses came and went. Doctors murmured updates, the sterile smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. Sarah and Lily never left the small waiting room outside the operating theater where Rex fought for his life. Every time the door swung open, Lily's head shot up, her eyes wide with desperate hope. Finally, the surgeon stepped out, his expression grave, but not without light. "He's stable for now," he said. "It was close, very close, but he's a fighter." Lily burst into tears, throwing her arms around Sarah's waist. Sarah pressed her cheek to her daughter's hair, sobbing quietly with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." They were allowed into the recovery room, where Rex lay connected to monitors, his chest rising in slow, steady breaths. Lily climbed carefully onto the chair beside him, resting her head against his side, her small fingers tracing the bandages. "You stayed," she whispered, her tears soaking his fur. "I knew you would." Sarah stood behind her, brushing hair from her daughter's face, her own eyes shimmering. She leaned close to Rex, her voice soft but resolute. "If he doesn't have a place to go, we'll be his home, always." Rex's tail gave the faintest thump against the blanket, and Sarah smiled through her tears. She glanced toward Daniel standing quietly in the doorway, his body wrapped in bandages, his face pale, but his eyes watching with something she hadn't seen before, longing. He hesitated, then stepped inside. "I don't want to intrude." "You're not," Sarah said softly, her gaze locking with his. "You're part of this now." His throat tightened as he looked at the girl curled against the dog, then back at Sarah. For a man who had lost everything, the sight felt like being handed something he never thought he'd have again, a family. He swallowed hard, stepping closer, his voice quiet. "I don't know how to be anything else, but if you'll let me, I'd like to try." Sarah's lips trembled as she nodded, emotion flooding her chest. "Then try. With us." The room was filled with silence, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence of belonging, of wounds, beginning to knit together, of hope, daring to take root in the ashes of despair. Sarah took Daniel's hand. Lily nestled against Rex, and for the first time in years, the cold that had haunted her heart began to thaw. The storm outside had ended. But in this room, something far stronger had begun, a promise that none of them would ever be alone again. The snow had finally surrendered. Months had passed since that night, when the mountain roared with gunfire and avalanches, when the storm itself had seemed determined to erase every fragile heartbeat still clinging to life. Now the valley of Silver Creek was changing. The harsh white blanket had melted into streams that trickled along the edges of dirt roads, feeding the awakening earth. Buds burst from the skeletal trees, their branches trembling with the first whispers of spring. The town, once held hostage by the blizzard, began to breathe again. But for Sarah Mitchell, Lily Daniel, and the loyal German shepherd named Rex, spring didn't just mean survival. It meant rebirth. The modest property on the edge of town had once been an abandoned barn. Weathered beams sagged under years of neglect, and the roof had leaked when Sarah first walked through it. Yet with time, sweat, and the kind of determination born only from fire and loss, it had been transformed. The sign above the refurbished doors now read, "Rex's Haven." The letters gleamed in fresh paint framed by climbing ivy, and the smell of sawdust still lingering in the air. Below the name in smaller letters were the words, "A Sanctuary for the Forgotten." Sarah stood outside, the crisp air carrying the scent of damp soil and new grass. She wiped her hands on her jeans, sunlight warming her auburn hair as she watched Lily chase after Rex across the yard. The dog's stride was uneven now. The injury from that night had cost him more than blood. A sleek prosthetic replaced his hind leg, its titanium joint gleaming in the morning sun. At first the sight had broken Sarah's heart. But Rex had adapted with the stubborn resilience that defined him. He no longer ran like before, but he moved with purpose, unbent, his ears perked, and his amber eyes burning with the same fire that had carried them through the storm. Lily laughed, breathless, as she threw a ball. Rex darted after it, tail whipping the prosthetic, kicking up small tufts of dirt. When he returned, Lily threw her arms around his neck, whispering something only the dog could hear. Sarah felt a swell in her chest, that rare mixture of pride, gratitude, and a trace of ache. The ache came every time she remembered the cost of their survival. The faces of the men who had hunted them still haunted her at night. The sight of Rex collapsing into the snow after the bullet tore into him replayed in flashes. Daniel's body limp and bloodied in her arms as she swore they wouldn't lose him. There were scars on all of them, some visible, most not. But scars, Sarah had learned, were not just reminders of pain. They were proof of survival. Proof they had lived. Behind her, the door creaked open. Daniel stepped out, his posture still carrying the weight of injuries that time hadn't fully erased. He leaned lightly on the wooden frame sunlight, striking the faint line of a scar along his temple. The badge that had once defined him no longer rested at his hip. He wasn't Sheriff Hayes anymore. The uniform, the authority, the trust of the people he had once sworn to protect, all of it had been stripped away when the truth about the betrayal inside his department came to light. The system he had bled for had turned its back. Yet as Sarah's gaze met his, she saw no defeat in his steel blue eyes. There was weariness, yes, loss. But there was also something else, a steadiness she hadn't seen the first night they dragged him out of that overturned vehicle. "You've been out here since sunrise," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying the low rasp of someone who'd spoken too many words in courtrooms and interrogation rooms, but who now found peace in fewer syllables. Sarah smiled faintly. "The animals don't wait for the clock, and neither does Lily." His gaze drifted toward the field where Lily was now kneeling beside Rex, scratching his ears as the dog leaned into her touch. A smile touched his lips, small but real. "She's tougher than either of us," he murmured. "She had to be," Sarah replied, her voice quieter now. She looked away, blinking against the sting of memory. The nights after her husband's death, when Lily had crawled into her bed, whispering that she didn't want Mommy to cry anymore. The long months of silence in the house that had once been filled with laughter. They had both been drowning in absence until a storm, and a dog had forced them to fight for more. Daniel stepped closer, his limp almost imperceptible now, though she knew every step still carried pain. He touched the edge of the sign with his fingertips, tracing the painted letters. "Rex's Haven," he said almost to himself. "It suits him." "He deserves it," Sarah replied firmly. "After everything, he deserves more than a medal that gathers dust in a drawer." "He saved us, Daniel, all of us." As if hearing his name, Rex barked once, sharp and proud, before bounding toward them. Lily followed, cheeks flushed pink from the chill and the joy of play. She grabbed Sarah's hand with one small, determined squeeze. "Mom," Lily said breathlessly, "can we keep Rex forever?" Sarah glanced down, her lips curving into a smile, even as her throat tightened. She had already made the decision months ago, the night she sat by Rex's side in the veterinary clinic, whispering promises into his fur, while praying he'd survive the surgery. "Forever?" Sarah said softly, meeting Lily's wide, hopeful eyes. "He's ours, as long as he wants to stay." Lily threw her arms around Rex again, giggling when the dog licked her cheek. Daniel watched them, and Sarah noticed the way his expression shifted, that subtle mix of longing and belonging, as if he hadn't realized until now that he'd stopped being an outsider in their lives. The moment was interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A small pickup truck rolled up the dirt drive. Sarah's friend and fellow vet tech, June, hopped out waving. In the back of the truck, a crate rattled softly. Inside, a trembling pup with matted fur and frightened eyes stared out. "Got a call about him," June said as she lifted the crate down. "Left on the side of the road, half-starved. Figured Rex's Haven was the right place." Sarah's chest tightened as she knelt to meet the pup's gaze. The little dog whimpered, pressing against the bars. She whispered, gently coaxing, and when the door finally opened, the pup crept into her arms, shivering but trusting. Rex stepped closer, sniffed the newcomer, and then with a dignified snort licked the pup's head. The message was clear. "You're safe here." Lily beamed. "He's saying welcome." Sarah's throat burned with emotion as she held the fragile creature. Behind her, Daniel's hand brushed lightly against her shoulder, a quiet grounding presence. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the fields gold, the four of them sat outside on the porch. Lily leaned against Sarah's side, Rex resting his head on Daniel's knee. The pup curled beside them. For a moment there was no storm, no gunfire, no shadows of betrayal. There was only warmth. Daniel broke the silence, his voice low. "You know, I don't have much left. No badge, no home, no plan." He looked at Sarah, his expression raw with vulnerability. "But if you'll have me, I'd like to stay. With you. With both of you." Sarah studied him, her heart swelling with something she hadn't dared to feel since her husband's death. "Hope. If you don't have a place to go," she said softly, echoing the words she'd once whispered to Rex, "then this is your home." Daniel's throat worked as he nodded, emotion glinting in his eyes. Rex barked once, as if sealing the promise. The months ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing never was. The shadows of that night would always linger, waiting in the quiet corners of memory. But they weren't defined by what they had lost anymore. They were defined by what they had chosen to fight for. The next morning, as Sarah unlocked the doors of Rex's haven, and the first families arrived, some carrying stray dogs, some simply seeking comfort, she felt something stir deep inside. She knelt beside Rex, brushing her fingers through his fur. The prosthetic paw clicked gently against the wooden floor as he shifted eyes steady on her face. "You ready, partner?" she whispered. Rex's tail thumped once hard, and his bark echoed through the sanctuary like a vow. The camera would linger on him, proud and unbroken, as a child entered the doorway, timidly reaching out a hand. Rex stepped forward, prosthetic gleaming, and nudged the child's palm with the gentlest touch. The child smiled, a fragile, precious spark of hope lighting his face. And then the voiceover would rise, carrying the story home. Miracles don't always come with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes they come as a set of bloody paw prints in the snow, and a heart that refuses to give up. In Silver Creek, hope was reborn, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage of a dog who never stopped believing. And because of him, a family was forged. A family that chose to stand together, even when the storm tried to tear them apart. The screen would fade to white. The sound of Rex's steady bark carrying through the silence. A reminder that courage and love could outlast even the coldest storm.